Bill MacArthur was so broken, so grief-stricken, that he was shaking. His wife's body lay dead inside the house, slumped inside an upstairs closet, while he sat on the front steps in a state of bereavement. Law enforcement was in full force at the scene, cordoning off the crime scene from swarming media and curious neighbors. One Little Rock police officer, a patrolman, saw Bill MacArthur on the front steps. He recognized him as a fellow parishioner at his church. He wasn't used to seeing him in such a state. MacArthur was normally such a stoic, unemotional man. MacArthur tried to light a cigarette, but his trembling hands made it difficult. That patrolman, without saying a word, wandered over, gently took the lighter from MacArthur's hands, and lit the cigarette for him. It was clear that Bill MacArthur was intensely distraught. He was a man who needed the support of his family and friends. Anyone who deals with the death of a loved one, particularly when that loved one is the victim of a homicide, is consumed with a level of grief that never goes away. The best you can do is learn how to handle the pain better over time. In Bill MacArthur's case, it wasn't just ever-present grief that he would have to contend with. In very little time, he was going to have to deal with a tide of public perception that he could not have ever dreamed of. A certain law enforcement officer, one who was elected by the people, one who never saw a microphone he did not want to speak into, and one who had his eyes on higher office, was going to make Bill MacArthur's life an even worse hell. All Little Rock police detectives could think about was solving the Alice McArthur case. Literally, that was the edict that came down from the top. Whatever other investigations detectives had, they had to put them on hold. Until further notice, there was only one case that the department had to solve: the MacArthur case. From the start, it seemed as though the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office and the Little Rock Police Department were investigating two different cases. The former's investigation was being directed by the whims of its leader, while the other was moving in a more prudent fashion. That disparity was immediately obvious to attorney Chris Piazza, who wound up being the lead prosecutor in the Alice McArthur murder case. Piazza was summoned one Saturday, soon after the murder, to his boss's office. His boss was dubbed Bentley, and Bentley was in the middle of an uncomfortable meeting with Sheriff Tommy Robinson and a member of Robinson's command staff. Piazza got the lowdown on Sheriff Robinson's theories about the murder. Robinson did not think Alice was shot where her body was found.
It was real obvious that she was shot in that room, but they were trying to say she was shot in there because they're going to say that Bill MacArthur dragged her in there and put her in the closet. I listened to that crap and I said to Tommy, I said, "Do you have the Little Rock file?" Hell no, I don't have that. They don't know what they're doing. That's exactly what he said.
Piazza went downstairs to his office, grabbed the LRPD file, walked back upstairs, and showed Tommy Robinson photos of Alice's body and the hole in the wall caused by the same bullet that killed Alice. He told him that was proof that Alice was killed in the very spot where her body lay. Robinson got angry, turned to Piazza's boss and said, quote, "Dub, I never can talk to you without this smart-ass son of a bitch here," end quote. Piazza thought of a few choice words for Tommy Robinson at that moment, and he made sure to say them before storming out of the room. Meanwhile, Little Rock police still had a trail of clues to follow, and it did not take long for them to track down the florist who sold the gunman the flowers left at the MacArthur home. It literally took less than 18 hours from the time police were called to the murder scene. A detective, Al Dawson, arrived at Leroy's flower shop in Little Rock, not far from the Pleasant Valley neighborhood. The floral arranger and cashier remembered the man who came in and bought the bouquet. They were shown a photo of Bill MacArthur, and they both said with certainty that he was not the one who entered the shop that day. A police sketch artist came up with a drawing based on the woman's description. Dawson got a copy of the drawing and laid it next to a mugshot of Yankee Hall, who was someone local law enforcement knew about. He was already among the people law enforcement were looking at in connection with the May 21st bombing. The resemblance between the mugshot and the sketch was obvious. By that point, Yankee Hall was already nervous. The gun, the clipboard, the fake delivery list, and the fake florist sign were all disposed of. But there was one item that was left behind at the crime scene: the flowers. Yankee told that to Orsini when he contacted her shortly after the killing. She assured him it would be fine. She said Bill MacArthur would dispose of the flowers. Orsini continued with the ruse that Bill MacArthur was actively involved in the murder of his wife, and Yankee took her word for it. Mary Lee told Yankee that he would get his money on Monday, which fell the day after July 4th. She said she would get it from a bank safety deposit box. Banks were going to be closed for the holiday, so Yankee explained to her that the earliest she could fetch the money would be Tuesday. Yankee's frustration was building. So was his skepticism of the woman who had conned him into committing a murder. The next morning, Yankee was visited by a police officer he knew. Yankee had been an informant for the police, and this particular police officer was the one Yankee dealt with the most. The two were riding together, and they drove by the florist. When Yankee saw that an unmarked police car was parked there, he got nervous. He started asking the police officer questions, such as whether connecting the purchase of the flowers to someone would be enough for an arrest. He also asked whether the person charged in the murder could possibly get the death penalty. The police officer got suspicious and told Yankee that if he knew something, he should speak to a Little Rock police detective. Yankee had no intention of doing that. The police officer did manage to convince Yankee to talk to someone. He got him to talk to a retired police detective. That former detective was employed by the U.S. Department of Justice, and he was skilled at interviewing suspects. Yankee naively went into that interview thinking he could outsmart him. Yankee did not wind up giving the Justice Department official any sort of admission statement, but he did say a lot. Yankee thought he was clever enough to give him pieces of information to take the heat off him, but his effort had an opposite effect. The official who interviewed Yankee asked him specifically about Mary Lee Orsini and whether she had money trouble. He said that she did. Yankee talked a little more about her before claiming he hardly knew her. Yankee was asked about whether he knew any black men who might know something about the killing. Yankee said he was only friends with one black person who knows something about the criminal world in Little Rock, but he declined to give his name. The Justice Department official asked Yankee specifically whether he knew of a black man who drove a 70-something model Cadillac, brown in color, that was being used to deliver flowers. Yankee, who was in a full bead sweat at this point, gave a weird, deflective answer to that question. He said the flowers at the crime scene were probably picked up at a cemetery because the cemetery has flowers all over the place. He said, quote, "I mean, that's what I would do," end quote. Little Rock police listened to the tape of that interview. Around that same time, one of the department's detectives had already fingered Larry Darnell McLendon as the other suspect. Yankee and McLendon had been seen around town before the murder drinking together, and a car registered to McLendon fit the description of the car seen at the MacArthur house to a T. Mary Lee Orsini knew that Yankee had someone help him commit the murder, and knew the man was Larry McLendon. Knowing that she did not have a dime to give Yankee and McLendon, she started to think of ways to pin the murder on them. She had to figure that the two men, if caught, would tell the cops everything. But this was a woman who was convinced she could get away with murder.
You love cheering on the home team. You never miss the date night. But as you were enjoying these moments, our city was changing. When history is made in Arkansas, will you be the last to know? Stay ahead, stay informed. Go to arkansasonline.com.
Larry Burge was a North Little Rock realtor who had befriended Mary Lee Orsini. Whether he wanted to be more than a friend is a matter of speculation, but he was one of the many men in Orsini's life she knew she could manipulate. Burge became suspicious of Mary Lee, but still carried out strange tasks for her. including making anonymous calls to police to feed them information that she wanted them to know. The information could not come from her. They recognized her voice, and she was already under a dense cloud of suspicion, so she got Burge to make those calls. On July 4th, a couple days after the Alice McArthur slaying, Orsini convinced Burge to contact the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office, and he spoke to a few people there, including Sheriff Tommy Robinson. Burge gave them Larry McLendon's name and the address to McLendon's mother's home where he lived. Burge also said Mary Lee Orsini's name was on a hit list that included Alice McArthur, indicating that Orsini would be the next one killed. The sheriff's office immediately started looking for McLendon, but never shared the tip with the Little Rock police. But the department was already on the lookout for McLendon. It was just a matter of who would find him first. McLendon was not home when the sheriff's deputies showed up at his mother's house a couple days after the shooting, but when he learned about it, he talked to Yankee, who by then was also feeling the walls closing in. Both of them knew they were not going to remain free men for long. Leaving town was not an option. They were out of money, and the authorities knew what cars they drove. They were out of moves. It appeared that the search for Yankee and McLendon was not uncovered by the media, or maybe they were just too distracted to notice. They were mostly interested in the organized crime angle, which was catnip for the Arkansas-Gazette and Arkansas Democrat, which were engaged in a newspaper war for the ages, competing against each other for the juiciest stories they could uncover. The man serving them most of the juice was Tommy Robinson, who remained committed to the notion that the county he was sworn to protect was being terrorized by some amorphous crime syndicate. He banged that drum hard following the Bob Trout orchestrated beating of a local club owner and the Ron Orsini murder. And by the time word got out about the Alice McArthur killing, Robinson had a rapturous audience. That was not good for Bill MacArthur. The sheriff was framing the organized crime story squarely around the grieving criminal defense lawyer. The Arkansas Gazette printed a story the Monday after the slaying that Bill MacArthur was set up to gain significantly more wealth following his wife's death because her family was worth a fortune in the oil business. Gene Lyons would later write in his book, Widow's Web, that the claim was factually incorrect, but the Arkansas Gazette ran with it, and did so because it was information dropped on them by Tommy Robinson. In fact, the opposite was true. Alice did not have a will or any life insurance. Her death actually moved Bill MacArthur closer to financial ruin than windfall. All things considered, it was easy to see that those who digested the news about this case, and about Bill MacArthur specifically, would have their suspicions about him.
There were a number of things that made Bill MacArthur an object of suspicion. One was the phrase a nightclub owner. Another was the fact that he was such a handsome man. He was a criminal defense attorney, and they talked about him as patrician, which if you ever had met him, it's the last thing anybody would call him if they knew him. He was a guy from Clinton, Arkansas, who'd been a bull rider in a rodeo. He was not a country club guy at all, quite the opposite. But all of those things combined to make him seem very suspicious.
In the late afternoon of July 5th, 1982, almost exactly 72 hours after Alice McArthur was killed, Little Rock police detectives showed up at Yankee Hall's apartment and arrested him. Yankee called his attorney, a man by the name of Paul Johnson, a former law partner of Bill MacArthur's. Johnson and MacArthur had a serious falling out years earlier. Police laid out what they had against Yankee: fingerprints on the flower pot and a handwritten card with his fingerprints on it, plus eyewitnesses seeing him at the scene of the crime and the 2 eyewitnesses from the florist who confirmed he was the one who had bought the flowers found at the crime scene. Yankee promised the Little Rock police that he would divulge everything if it meant he could walk. He was told that would never happen. Yankee decided at that moment to remain silent, but his attorney, Paul Johnson, said something to the police before Yankee was sent to his holding cell. Yankee would spill the beans about Bill MacArthur and say that the hotshot attorney was the figure behind it all. At one point shortly after Yankee's arrest, Tommy Robinson made a call to Chris Piazza. Piazza still remembers that conversation with the sheriff and described it recently during an interview with me and my co-host, Daniel McFadin.
And he said, "Chris, I want you to recognize Yankee Hall out of jail tonight." I said, what? I said, he's charged with capital murder, and you want me to walk out of the jail? I said, I can't do that. Plus, I wouldn't if I were in charge. But you can call my boss, and he's not that fucking stupid. And he said, exact words, he said, well, I'm going to come arrest your ass for obstructing government operations. And apparently he hit the phone down so hard that he broke his phone.
Tommy Robinson did not follow through on his threat. Chris Piazza, who by this point already had a couple of blow-ups with Robinson, came to the realization that he had to keep a level head during his dealings with him. Robinson fought dirty, and Piazza knew he could not afford to stoop as low.
But Tommy was as worse than any criminal had been out there.
There were a couple more turns in the case, and they all went in the police's favor. Larry Burge would soon be recruited by Mary Lee Orsini to make one last phone call. This time, Burge called Mary Lee, posing as someone with inside information on the Alice McArthur murder, and warned her that she was next on the hit list. Mary Lee recorded the call, intending to turn it over to the sheriff's office. Burge read from a script written by Mary Lee. A portion of that script reads as follows. Burge, I can't stay on the phone all day with you, okay? Orsini, all right, I'll hear you out. Burge, Mr. Larry McLendon, McClendon, is the person who actually committed the crime last Friday afternoon. Orsini, who killed Alice? Burge, yes, and he intended to kill you also. Orsini, is this Larry McLendon a white man or a black man? Burge, he is black. He is definitely black. Later during the same scripted conversation, Burge described a white man who was partnering with McLendon. After that task was done, Larry Burge was done making calls for Orsini. He had been convinced that Mary Lee had nothing to do with Alice McArthur's death, but he no longer was. She had too much inside information. Suspecting also that Orsini's conniving ways would lead investigators to him, Burge drove the next day to his attorney's office, handed him the script he read from, and asked him to put it in a safe place, in case he needed to give the authorities proof of who was pulling the strings. Meanwhile, Yankee wasn't quite at the point of snitching on Mary Lee, but it was inevitably going to happen, and it happened soon after police picked up Larry McLendon. Police spotted McLendon the Tuesday after the murder. He showed up at Yankee's apartment to collect the money that was promised to him, his share of the $25,000. When he got there, someone at the apartment complex told McLendon that Yankee had been busted the day before. McLendon left on foot, and that's when police moved in to arrest him. They discovered and seized his Cadillac soon thereafter. Yankee Hall and Larry McLendon were in nearby holding cells later that same day at Little Rock Police Headquarters. McLendon told Yankee that they were behind bars for one reason: Mary Lee Orsini. Yankee spoke to police again, and they finally convinced him, after showing him more evidence that he was being used by Orsini, that he was fully under the spell of a wicked woman. For instance, the calls he made to Mary Lee after the bombing, calls that he did not realize were being recorded, were handed over to the authorities by Orsini herself. She had cleverly edited them to sound like the caller was the bomber, and that he was threatening her. According to Gene Lyon's book, a despondent and defeated Yankee would later tell authorities, quote, "This was all part of her plot. This was all supposed to come together after Alice was dead. She's planning all of this because she's gonna say I killed Ron. I killed Alice. I tried to kill her. She planted evidence on me from the day I met her, and I was so weak, man, I never suspected a thing." End quote.
Yankee Hall talking when the veteran Little Rock cop who talked to him, oh, she was a society broad, never wore jeans until she was 20. You know, she was about as much of a society broad as my dog Aspen, who's here on the floor with both feet sticking high up in the air. I mean, she sold him a completely fictional personality, which he bought. So she was able to do that. I guess she had considerable histrionic skills.
With him and McLendon in custody, Yankee knew the only card he could play to avoid a possible death sentence was to come clean about Mary Lee Orsini. A A day after Alice's funeral, the same day that both the Arkansas Democrat and the Arkansas-Gazette published stories about the arrests of Yankee Hall and Larry McLendon, Bill MacArthur was asked to come to Little Rock Police headquarters. He was told that Yankee Hall was implicating him in his wife's murder, and it shook him. It also astonished him that Yankee Hall, a complete stranger to him, knew so much about him and so much about his dealings with Mary Lee Orsini. In particular, all those times she visited him and spoke to him. That's when it finally dawned on Bill MacArthur that Mary Lee Orsini, who he believed from the outset was innocent of her late husband's murder, was probably guilty of killing both Ron Orsini and his wife, Alice. Bill MacArthur was a successful defense attorney, and he had a knack for undermining police's testimony. He had spent his career exposing misstep after misstep committed by police investigators. Perhaps that's why he ignored the warnings from the likes of T.J. Farley and Buddy Miles and others at the North Little Rock Police Department, who told them point blank that she, Mary Lee Orsini, was guilty as hell. And if she got away with murder, she's sure gonna do it again to somebody else. Gene Lyons wrote in his book that Bill MacArthur dismissed those warnings given to him at the time as typical police paranoia. In the days, weeks, and months after Alice's murder, after he was ensnared in a publicity campaign that would permanently damage him, he wished he had listened to them. A few developments needed to take place before authorities had enough certainty to arrest Mary Lee Orsini. Yankee Hall's statements were not enough. By mid-July, Yankee Hall and Larry McLendon were transferred to the county jail, so they were under the control of Sheriff Tommy Robinson. This angered those at the Little Rock Police Department because they lacked faith that Robinson could conduct a competent investigation, and because Robinson would not share any of his information, however misguided it was, or listen to theirs. But the recording of the call Larry Burge had made to Mary Lee Orsini, which the latter had handed over to the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office, somehow finally made its way to one of the lead investigators at the Little Rock Police Department. After he heard it, and after it was told to him that the voice on the recording was that of Larry Burge, the detective called in Burge for questioning. Burge did not want to come clean at first, and asked to speak to his lawyer. Police told him that he could do so, but he had until 2 p.m. on July 15th to give them a statement, or else he'd be arrested. Burge showed up on time with his lawyer to give that statement. He confirmed he was the man on the recording, and that Mary Lee Orsini was the woman he was talking to. Then he handed over the script to detectives. Police finally had what they needed to make a third arrest in the case. Chris Piazza said the Little Rock police had to search for Orsini without the use of one of their most important tools, the radio. They were afraid that Sheriff Tommy Robinson or one of his deputies would hear the chatter over their radios and disrupt the Little Rock Police Department's attempts to arrest her.
We had people on the street looking for her. We had detectives and looking for her, but we didn't want to talk to them over the line because he'd be listening and find out we had a warrant for her. And so we did find her. They were calling through phone booths and shit. That's how they were calling back. We got her in there and got her charged.
Mary Lee Orsini was found and arrested outside her mother's home. After she was apprehended, the media were tipped off. Police even gave a courtesy call to Bill MacArthur's father, who told his son the news of Orsini's capture. It seemed every major player in and around Little Rock was told of the arrest, except for one. The one person who did not get the call was Tommy Robinson. He watched it all unfold on the news. According to Gene Lyons' book, he flew into a rage. He believed Mary Lee Orsini was a pawn, not the ringleader. He was in the middle of his own investigation, one that was not going to stop until he had uncovered Little Rock's biggest crime ring, one that involved Bill MacArthur. But the case was out of his control now, and in control of the prosecuting attorney's office. But Robinson was not going to let himself be sidelined, not while he still had a breaking story-hungry media at his beck and call. The piles of documents Gene Lyons waded through during the research of his book was probably enough to fill not one but 2 offices. And among those documents were the files from a civil case related to a lawsuit filed by one of the North Little Rock police investigators in the Ron Orsini case. He had filed his lawsuit against Tommy Robinson. Lyons said the case file contained the investigative reports that Robinson had done in the Mary Lee Orsini case, and it was clear, even to the untrained eye, that Robinson's reports were devoid of anything substantive. Robinson lacked any abilities in the field of crime solving. It lacked even a shred of evidence against Bill MacArthur, who he believed all along was involved in his wife's murder. Lyons told me that Robinson's incompetence was staggering. It was like everything Robinson learned about the investigations he picked up from below-average network cop shows.
He just sold MacArthur as this corrupt, aristocratic criminal defense lawyer. Nobody likes them till they need them. He just knew how to sell that story because he's just following instincts of his own. That son of a bitch is crooked, and he did it, and that's it. And swinging further and further afield in his so-called investigation, search of something that would stick. But of course, he never found anything because there wasn't anything to find.
Gene Lyons was not the only one who felt that way. Al Dawson, the detective for the Little Rock Police Department in charge of the Alice McArthur murder investigation, never ceased to be amazed and angered by the antics of Sheriff Tommy Robinson. At the time, the sheriff was regularly going public with his suspicions of Bill MacArthur and making it out as though he and his agency were the only ones looking into him. But Robinson would occasionally call Dawson's supervisors. Basically, Orsini would tell the sheriff something and it would wind up trickling down to Dawson. So, it was incumbent upon him to check out every lead, no matter how bogus. The detective would follow everything to its rightful end, and every lead was a dead end. As soon as Dawson would reach a conclusion on one tip, he would get another, then another. Dawson described the circus to Lyons, saying, quote, "I was really getting fed up. I was getting frustrated and angry having to go back and do this just to appease Tommy's ego," end quote. But Dawson did not really have a choice, even though he did not work for Tommy Robinson. He went on to say, quote, "You're not talking about jaywalking. You're talking about conspiracy to commit murder. This is not something that's just going to be taken care of. You've got to take them as far as they can go. Every question, you've got to run it down. And it's getting to the point where it's over and over again, and it turns out to be the same thing. Nothing, nothing, nothing," end quote. Robinson was both a disruptive and destructive force in the investigation. On August 30th, 8 weeks after the Alice McArthur murder, Yankee Hall agreed to meet Sheriff Tommy Robinson and prosecutor Chris Piazza to give a sworn statement. He was accompanied by his lawyer, Paul Johnson. Piazza had known Johnson for years. The interaction the two men had following the end of that interview was one that Piazza was not expecting. Let's just say criminal law was not always a gentleman's game in Little Rock during the early 1980s. Here is Chris Piazza describing that interaction with Paul Johnson.
He came out into the hall. Yankee was in one of the rooms. He'd been talking to him, and he said to me and Dove and everybody around, "I'll give you Bill MacArthur tonight," meaning we could do a deal with him to get Bill MacArthur. Well, Yankee didn't even know anything about Bill MacArthur. You know, and I said, "Well, we may get to that day someday, but we're just not now." I said, "We're going to keep working on this case." And he told me he was going to whip my ass. And we'd been friends. We played in a golf tournament together in Hot Springs and liked each other. But we ended up in the parking lot out there, and the cops had to break us up before we got into it. That's how volatile this was. It's crazy.
I read portions of that interview that Yankee Hall had with Piazza and Tommy Robinson in Episode 3. And while the recording hasn't been heard by too many people, the full transcript of it was read by thousands of people 43 years ago. As I mentioned before, the Arkansas Gazette and Arkansas Democrat were locked in a battle of one-upsmanship for the duration of this case, and Robinson in particular was more than willing to use that bitter rivalry to his advantage. The sheriff had reporters he could count on to print whatever he told them. And if reporters, and editors for that matter, felt as though the other paper was getting too much ink from him, he'd oblige them by telling them something new that they could break with. That's exactly what happened after Hall gave his statement to Robinson and Piazza. A reporter who Robinson regularly fed information to at the Gazette got a call late one night tipping her off that Yankee Hall had made an admission statement. And it wasn't just that he admitted to his part in the murder. He also implicated Bill MacArthur in the killing. That reporter was told to go to a location and pick up a cassette tape, which contained a recording of Yankee's statement. That recording contained Yankee's statements against Bill MacArthur, that he was behind it all. The problem was that Yankee never met Bill, never spoke to him. He kept describing everything Mary Lee was telling him about MacArthur, that he was supplying the money for the hit job, money that Mary Lee never got from him or was ever going to get. Yankee also said MacArthur was the one who wanted his wife dead. MacArthur's motivation, according to Yankee, was that Alice was threatening to take everything from Bill, including his kids and his law practice. The cherry-picked sections of the transcript of that conversation Yankee had with Tommy Robinson and Chris Piazza were published in the Gazette, along with the reporter's story, and it landed on newsstands the morning after the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office arrested Bill MacArthur. Additionally, the 6 o'clock local news showed footage of a long-faced MacArthur being walked down a hallway, handcuffed, on his way to being booked on a murder charge. MacArthur was not completely blindsided. He had an idea something like that was going to happen. He got an early warning about it from Chris Piazza. The lead prosecutor in the case knew that he had to let Bill MacArthur know what Tommy Robinson was up to. Some time after the confrontation Piazza had with Robinson in Dub Bentley's office, the prosecutor called Bill MacArthur over the phone and asked him to come to his office. He had something important to tell him. After he arrived, Piazza told him that the sheriff was zeroing in on him and planned to arrest him for his wife's murder.
And Bill, I had the window in the office, and he looked out the window, turned back around, tears streaming down his face, and he said, "How can I be hurting more than I already have? My wife's dead. My family's destroyed." And that was the worst miscarriage of justice that I've seen. Is to use a badge to just destroy somebody in that way.
As I mentioned earlier, Robinson sought to take advantage of Little Rock's major newspapers stepping over each other to get a splashy story. So, after the Gazette ran a couple of pieces about Yankee Hall's admission statements and his attempts to implicate Bill MacArthur, John Robert Starr, the editor of the Democrat, grew livid and called Tommy Robinson. Kerry Bradburn, who at the time was a Democrat reporter, recalled that eventful day.
We were aware that Hall had made a confession, but, didn't have copies of it. Well, Starr went ape, and Tommy gave him the whole confession, and the Democrat published it in the paper. And I got called back to the office that day and wrote a story about it. And so there were a couple of redactions, but pretty much the whole confession was out there in the paper.
Gene Lyons remembered it too.
Yankee Hall's entire testimony was printed first on the front page of the Gazette, and then the whole thing, unexpurgated, was printed in the Democrat. And it had a tremendous impact on people because Yankee Hall was a man in the grips of a delusion, and he had been convinced that Bill MacArthur was paying Orsini to do this killing. It was just, another one of her fantastic lies. But it got out there, and it made MacArthur a figure of great suspicion.
The Democrat wound up selling out all of its copies of its September 2nd, 1982 edition by midday. While the newspaper war was in full swing, so was the war between Tommy Robinson and the Little Rock Police Department. Baffled by the sheriff's decision to arrest Bill MacArthur on a murder charge, Little Rock police officers were relegated to sideline players in the case against MacArthur. There was something else in the original Gazette story that made the situation even worse for MacArthur. There was the detail about the pot of flowers. When police arrived at the house, the flowers were discovered by Alice's feet upstairs, The account from Yankee was that the flowers were dropped or set down by Alice near the front door. Tommy Robinson had always insisted that Bill MacArthur had been the one who moved those flowers. It was something Little Rock police did not believe, but they did not have an alternative explanation. Deputies from the sheriff's office showed up in large numbers to the scene, and they, along with police, entered and exited the house. Eventually, police did take command of the crime scene, but not until deputies had traipsed through the entire house. Crime scene investigations were not as sophisticated in 1982, so the police investigators paid little attention to the flowers and could not provide any rebuttal argument about why they wound up near the body, although many have alleged that Tommy Robinson had something to do with that. On that note, Gene Lyons told me that during the research of the book, he was surprised at just how wide the divide was between the Little Rock Police Department and the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office. He knew it existed, but it was the extent of it that surprised him.
Well, everybody knew that there was a dispute between the Little Rock Police Department and the Sheriff's Department. That the Sheriff's Department showed up at a crime scene in Little Rock in force and were seemingly on the scene before the Little Rock Police Department got there, which looked really fishy, and that there was great dispute over some of the physical evidence, specifically the flowers that Yankee Hall had bought to fake his way inside the house. Where had they been, and where did they go? It was alleged that Bill MacArthur must have moved them, but that couldn't have been true. And I think that was one of the things that was most surprising to me, that there was such mistrust and dislike. I knew that the Little Rock Police Department didn't like Tommy Robinson, but I didn't realize the depth of the feeling about him. So I would say that was one thing that was shocking to me.
Eugene Yankee Hall confessed to authorities on August 29, 1982, entered a plea of not guilty, and was sentenced to life in prison in October of that year. Larry McLendon, meanwhile, pleaded guilty and was awaiting trial, which would come in December of that year. Mary Lee Orsini, still awaiting trial herself, attempted and failed to convince a judge to grant her bail. Attorneys would find out later she regularly had company while in jail. She wound up standing trial the week of October 4th, 1982, a mere 3 months after the slaying of Alice McArthur. It may still go down as the highest publicized criminal trial in Arkansas history. Prosecutors were seeking life without parole for Orsini, opting not to pursue a death sentence for a female defendant. Orsini's attorneys were Jack Lassenberry, another skilled and highly reputable Little Rock trial attorney, and then 30-year-old Tom Carpenter, who would later become, and still is, the attorney for the city of Little Rock. Carpenter recently sat down and spoke with my co-host and described Orsini's demeanor the day he met her soon after her arrest.
She seemed personable. She didn't seem to be as concerned as I think a person should be if they're charged with capital murder.
While the trial as a whole was not all that spectacular, it did kick off on an interesting note. Chris Piazza, during his opening statement, used a chalkboard to draw a sketch of a wheel, with the hub containing the name Mary Lee Orsini. He drew spokes, and at the end of each spoke he wrote the names of her accomplices. Then, he manipulated the drawing to look like a spider's web. He told jurors, quote, "What you have, ladies and gentlemen, is a lady who spun the story and spun a web," end quote. When it came time for the defense's opening statement, Jack Lassenberry took off his blazer, turned it inside out, and used the lining of it to erase Piazza's chalkboard sketch. There was little he could say to counter Piazza's effective opening, but Lassenberry's decision to erase the chalkboard with his jacket got the courtroom attendees' attention. He would tell jurors it was absolute tragedy that the wife of a fellow lawyer was dead, but the only web being spun was being spun by the state. He added, quote, "We can't allow another tragedy in this courtroom," end quote, indicating that a wrongful guilty verdict would only be one tragedy stacked on top of another. Jury selection took 2 days. Amazingly, it took the state only 2 days to present its case. By the time it was the defense's turn to call its first witness, a stack of documents came into play that made Carpenter and his co-counsel want to cut loose of the case midstream.
We started the trial on Monday, like Thursday afternoon or Friday, maybe Wednesday, we were handed a stack of transcripts of telephone conversations between her and Sheriff Robinson and people on Sheriff Robinson's staff. And so here we're getting ready to go into a defense, and we've been working on everything, and now we find that our client's been saying all this stuff with the sheriff. So we go to the judge, and we basically file a motion under seal that says we need to be taken off this case because we really have a problem with this client. We told her, don't talk to people, and then we get these 30 pages or whatever it was of comments of what she had been saying to these people and how she was going to help them find stuff that was supposed to be able to get this whole case taken away. And the judge wouldn't let us talk. And so now we've got a real hell of a blow.
So the defense was never going to call Orsini to the stand. It wasn't that they were inclined to do so, but if they had been, those 30 pages of documents would have certainly been presented by the state during their cross-examination of her, effectively sealing her fate. Gene Lyons wrote in his book that Chris Piazza was actually hoping Orsini would not take the stand. Usually, a prosecutor salivates at the opportunity to cross-examine a defendant, but Piazza, as Lyons stated in his book, knew that Orsini was a mistrial waiting to happen. She could not be controlled and was capable of saying and doing anything, so he was relieved that she declined to testify at the urging of her attorneys. Jurors did hear from Yankee Hall, Larry Burge, Phoebe Pinkston, and a handwriting expert who matched the script Birch read from to Orsini's writing. Jurors also heard from Bill MacArthur, who got emotional on the stand recounting the details of July 2, 1982. Jurors were not told that MacArthur had been charged by the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office in the case. It was clear that the prosecution did not consider him a suspect, even though the sheriff had charged him. In all, 25 witnesses took the stand, and 38 pieces of evidence were presented to jurors, including the script that Burge read from when he made that mysterious phone call. There were also tape recordings, bullet fragments from the murder scene, and the remnants of the bomb that went off underneath Alice McArthur's car. During his closing, Chris Piazza had a theatrical trick up his sleeve. He walked over to the chalkboard, which again had Mary Lee Orsini's name etched on it. He talked about how Orsini had become the center of attention for so much of the trial. Then he took off his coat, turned it inside out the way his counterpart had days earlier, and scrubbed Orsini's name off the board, and told jurors to remember who they really should be thinking about the most, Alice McArthur. The courtroom erupted in applause. After the closing statements were finished, Mary Lee Orsini's fate was up to the 12-member jury, made up of 8 men and 4 women. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They returned with a guilty verdict for first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, the defendant sank into her chair. The loudest reaction in the courtroom came from her daughter, 15-year-old Tiffany, who could be heard sobbing. Eventually, Mary Lee began to sob. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tom Carpenter was asked by Daniel what feelings he conjures whenever he thinks about the case or is asked about it. He handled a lot of felony cases during his legal career, including his fair share of murder cases. None of them left him as confused as this one.
If I really think about the case, the first thing that hits me is a deep sadness that Alice McArthur is dead, and I could never figure out why. I mean, even in some of the murder cases I handled where the death penalty was on the table, I could at least understand why there had been a murder. And I have never understood it, and I never will.
Following the trial, Bill MacArthur did not say anything to reporters other than he was not surprised by the verdict. If there was any hope that the convictions and sentences of Yankee Hall and Mary Lee Orsini would be enough to placate Tommy Robinson, it was soon dashed. Gary Hoffman was a reporter for the Arkansas Democrat in 1982. He covered the Mary Lee Orsini trial and all the cases that her criminal activities spawned. He knew early on that Tommy Robinson was going to continue to generate headlines even after the Orsini verdict.
Robinson pretty much took over all the headlines after that. He decided MacArthur was in on it. He was harassing Doug Bentley, calling him names constantly. It seemed like every day he had a press conference. All the press would gather in his office. The guy never slept.
A little more than a month after the trial, on November 22, 1982, there was a probable cause hearing in the case against Bill MacArthur, which lasted 5.5 days. Basically, it served as a trial before a trial, or an extended evidentiary hearing to determine whether there should be a full-fledged criminal trial. And it was up to a judge to decide whether to move the case forward. Doug Bentley, Pulaski County's top prosecutor, had said publicly that he had intended not to prosecute MacArthur because no evidence supported it. So a special prosecutor was appointed for the probable cause hearing. Some of the case hinged on a witness who claimed to have seen MacArthur riding in an elevator with Mary Lee Orsini in a bank building, but his testimony was torn to shreds by MacArthur's attorneys. There were many more witnesses called during the hearing. Among them was a hypnotist who said a man resembling MacArthur had accompanied Orsini to his office in the spring or summer of 1981. Gary Hoffman recalls one particular witness who testified during the hearing, and he was astonished at the time over how little information that witness had.
The testimony during that hearing, they had some guy, his actually, I still remember, his nickname was Chicken George. It was George, I don't remember his last name, but Chicken George testified that he had seen somebody that looked like MacArthur in some type of incriminating, I don't know if he saw him with one of the Hall, McLendon, or somehow implicated MacArthur. And that was it, pretty much. That's all I can remember. And I remember going up to Larry Dill, who was Robinson's chief henchman, Major Larry Dill, and asked him, is this all you got? And he said, oh, no, there's a lot more. But it wasn't that much more.
Near the end, Mary Lee Orsini testified, and she claimed that Bill MacArthur had blackmailed her. She said that MacArthur had her and her family's lives in the palm of his hand and had her lie for him. It was an unconvincing performance. In the end, the judge in the case made a ruling that allowed the case against Bill MacArthur to continue to float in the air. Carrie Bradburn remembers the judge announcing his decision. It was one that seemed to go against the judge's better judgment.
He said it was the weakest case he'd ever seen, but he didn't have the guts to dismiss it. He sent it back basically to Doug Bentley again.
The ruling effectively meant that Bill MacArthur was not going to be prosecuted, at least not by Doug Bentley's office, because everyone in that office was an experienced lawyer who never thought for a moment that Robinson had a sliver of incriminating evidence against MacArthur.
Decisions made in Washington affect folks in Arkansas. I'm Alex Thomas, the Washington correspondent for the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. I'm keeping a close eye on what happens in the nation's capital and how decisions and decision-makers impact our state. Take, for instance, the next farm bill. We're connecting you with the policymakers drafting this legislation, as well as the Arkansas farmers vital to this state's economy. I know how much these decisions matter to everyday Arkansans, which is why I'm here in Washington, making sure you stay informed. This kind of coverage is only possible through your support. So consider subscribing at arkansasonline.com/ADG now.
Meanwhile, the last of the legitimate murder suspects, Larry Darnell McLendon, was tried in mid-December of 1982. The jury was deadlocked 11-1 on the capital murder charge and finally reached a verdict on a lesser charge of first-degree murder. They fixed his sentence to 20 years. McLendon shouted "Merry Christmas" to court observers and then was ushered away by bailiffs. By late January, Doug Bentley, officially announced his decision to drop the charges against Bill MacArthur. But, as expected, that was not going to stop Tommy Robinson from not only making his case through the media, but also manipulating the arms of justice as best he could. And somehow, he still had sway. 2 days after Bentley announced he would drop the charges, a circuit court judge announced that he would call a grand jury to conduct another investigation against MacArthur. And because Bentley never charged MacArthur, there was no double jeopardy law to violate. On Super Bowl Sunday, which fell on January 30th, 1983, the one in which the Washington Redskins defeated the Miami Dolphins, thousands of people across Arkansas witnessed on live television Bill MacArthur getting arrested for a second time. It was shown during halftime. Tommy Robinson was again talking a big game about it all, saying he worked around the clock to put together the case that would be presented to grand jurors. He even said that MacArthur had contracted 2 hitmen in a faraway town to kill Tommy. The amount of money he would give them was $500,000. This time, Robinson said, MacArthur's courthouse connections could do nothing to save him. It did not take long before it was clear that the hitmen story was all a farce, and finally, it was understood by most of the media that Tommy Robinson was showing signs of lunacy. The grand jury hearing began in February, and it was as clownish as expected. A local lawyer, Darrell Brown, famous for being the first black football player at the University of Arkansas, was appointed to present the evidence. Dub Bentley came nowhere near it, and after 4 weeks, Bill MacArthur finally took the stand. A portion of that testimony was heard in the last episode. By the time MacArthur did take the stand, he was battling depression and drinking and smoking heavily. The stress of everything was taking a toll on him. That was obvious to anyone who saw him. That was not lost on Gary Hoffman, the Arkansas Democrat reporter who observed MacArthur throughout the turmoil. Recently, when he sat down with Daniel, he sifted through old black and white photographs that we have kept in our archives, and those memories of a physically diminished MacArthur came back to him.
Yeah, there he is. I mean, MacArthur, he never really said anything publicly. But I just can't imagine what this guy went through. All because of her and Robinson.
Oddly enough, in spite of being forced to relive the horrors of July 2nd, 1982, one more time before a panel of jurors, MacArthur found some peace in the process. He could tell the jurors were there to do a job and to find out the truth, and the truth was squarely on his side. He would say later, and this passage was included in Gene Lyon's book, quote, "There were no wild or wildly accusatory type things. They, the grand jurors, had a pretty good grasp of what was going on, it seemed to me, because their questions were pertinent. They were to the point. They did not go off on any wild tangents or anything. They were very businesslike. They were truly inquiring about what had happened, and not on a witch hunt." End quote. After it was finally all over, in April of that year, the grand jury voted against an indictment, and it was unanimous, 16-0. After it was all over, after the 3 defendants were convicted, and after all the efforts to prosecute MacArthur had mercifully ended, Pulaski County Prosecutor Dub Bentley spoke to a gaggle of reporters in his office. Bentley told them his story about the Alice McArthur murder case. He said that Tommy Robinson was communicating with Mary Lee Orsini before the slaying, and that he had planned to have deputies at the scene to stop the crime in progress. What prevented that from happening was that Yankee Hall and Larry McLendon were late to the MacArthur house because they had car trouble. They actually did not get to the house until an hour later than originally scheduled. That long pause meant that Orsini and Robinson concluded that Hall and McLendon were not going to show up to commit the murder. But in fact, they did, and deputies were not in position to stop it. But they were close enough to respond to it faster than the Little Rock Police Department. Bentley, now deceased, always found that suspicious, and finally divulged those suspicions to reporters, off the record. Kerry Bradburn remembers that informal meeting.
He wanted us to know. I know that. But there wasn't anything any of us could do with that story, because he basically said, I'll deny anything if you try to quote me on that.
Tommy Robinson's profile somehow grew after the Orsini-McArthur saga. In 1984, he ran for U.S. Congress as a Democrat and won. He won re-election twice as a Democrat before leaving the party to become a Republican in 1989. A year after that, he ran for governor. He lost in the primary to Sheffield Nelson, who subsequently lost the 1990 election to Bill Clinton, who 2 years later won the White House. After he had left the House of Representatives, it was discovered in 1992 that Tommy Robinson had bounced nearly 1,000 checks from the U.S. House Bank. Even after that scandal, he ran for the U.S. House again in 2002, but lost. His farm went into bankruptcy in 2011, and Robinson finished his years running his wife's liquor store in Brinkley, Arkansas. He died in July 2024. He was 82 years old. As for Bill MacArthur, he continued to practice law, but his career and life were never the same again.
I don't think he ever really recovered. I don't think he ever did. He was clearly devastated by these events and could never get past them. And I asked him about the closest I ever got. I said, well, Bill, why didn't you just get out of here? Why didn't you just leave Little Rock, leave Arkansas, start a new life somewhere else? And he said, basically, do you think there's any chance it wouldn't follow me? And then he said, this is my home. This is where my parents are. This is where my children are. I'm not going to let that two-bit son of a bitch run me out of my home. And he was quite determined about that. But I think he was shattered. I don't think he ever really recovered from it.
MacArthur was living in an apartment in Little Rock when he collapsed one day in the fall of 2009. He died of natural causes at age 71. Larry McLendon was released from prison in 2004. He has not made any public comments about this case, and his whereabouts are unknown. Yankee Hall died in prison in 2019. He was 74 years old. As for Mary Lee Orsini, following her conviction in 1982, there was one more legal matter to take care of. Mary Lee Orsini had to be tried once more, this time for the 1981 murder of her husband, Ron Orsini. The trial began in October 1983. Dub Bentley was the lead prosecutor. It took trial jurors 2 hours to render a verdict of guilty. Linda House, Ron's sister, spoke to Gene Lyons during the research of his book and described the feelings she held for years for Mary Lee Orsini.
I never hated. People say, oh, I hate you, or oh, I hate him. They don't know what the word hate means. There's no, you just can't describe it. It's a sickening feeling. Sick. It's sick.
After the verdict was read, Orsini wept, as did her daughter, Tiffany, and the two embraced. After Mary Lee was led away, Tiffany turned and saw Linda House standing nearby. Here is Linda House describing to Gene Lyons what that confrontation was like and how she processed it afterward.
Started, going out the back door. She was right behind us. I mean, she was like, if we would have stopped, she'd have been on top of me quick. She was screaming and yelling. And we went through. She chased us through. The jurors were standing there. They had already filed out and come around. As soon as they read the verdict, they come into a little room there. Mm-hmm. But when I went out, Doug Bentley was standing there, and he said, go through there. And so when we went through there, all the jurors were standing around. Mm-hmm. We went right through the middle of jurors. Mm-hmm. And she was right in behind us.
And nobody tried to restrain her?
I guarantee if she'd got hold of me out there in that hole, she'd have pulled me to the floor. I guarantee she would have.
How long have you ever forgiven her? Or have you? Or maybe that's maybe. Yeah.
Gina, honey.
Just thinking that she's a child. She was a child.
She lost so much. And maybe I'm wrong, and everybody says I'm wrong. Nobody respects my opinion on this. She's lost so much. She didn't have anything to cling to except her mother's innocence. That's all she had going for her.
Mary Lee Orsini did get one small victory in June 1985. The Arkansas Supreme Court unanimously overturned Orsini's murder conviction for the death of her husband Ron. The higher court accused the lead prosecutor in the case, Dub Bentley, of presenting no real evidence that more than one person had participated in the killing. That was relevant because the jury instructions allowed for Bentley to maintain simultaneously that Mary Lee Orsini killed her husband because no one else could have done it, and also that if someone else killed him, she must have participated in the crime. Basically, the judge allowed the prosecutor to have it both ways, and the high court overturned the verdict on that basis. The state Supreme Court did not rule that Mary Lee Orsini could not be retried, but by 1985, Chris Piazza was the prosecuting attorney in Pulaski County. He decided not to try her again. She was already serving life, and it would benefit no one to go through another emotional trial. He also did not want to give Mary Lee Orsini the satisfaction of having another media stage. Gene Lyons wrote in his book that Linda House did not agree with Piazza's decision, but she also did not have enough fight left in her, and she too did not want Mary Lee Orsini to be thrust into the news again. Mary Lee did remain silently incarcerated for a while. The incarceration part would last a lifetime, but not the silence part.
Coming next week on the final episode of the Orsini tapes, hear a never-before-heard letter written to Bill MacArthur by Mary Lee Orsini. Then finally, a confession 22 years in the making.
The Orsini Tapes is a production of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. The show is written and hosted by Daniel McFadin and Tony Holt and is produced by Kyle McDaniel.
The archive audio for this podcast came from three sources: the North Little Rock Police Department, the Pulaski County Prosecutor's Office, and the Gene Lyons Collection at the University of Arkansas Library. A special thanks to Juliet Robinson for the hours she spent digitizing Gene Lyons tapes. We are deeply thankful.